There you have to worry about a lot of these assets like the airplanes, the air range around the Air Force bases. All these are extremely limited assets, and we are seeing how we can improve the throughput of these assets by optimizing their schedules and day-to-day operations.
I don't think it's hard to find problems to solve in the Department of Defense. And ideas are cheap, execution is really hard. So how have you guys navigated, the last 3 or 4 years of the real execution of, hey, you have a problem, you have a pain point, we have a product. How do we connect those and get to early adoption that starts to lay the foundation of the house for scale?
This is All Quiet on the Second Front, a podcast where boring conversations around defense tech and national security come to die. Join me, Tyler Sweat, and my Second Front comrades as we dismantle the mundane, cut through the bureaucratic BS to demystify the world of defense tech. But be warned, this is not a typical government podcast. Ready to get weird?
What's up, everybody? I am TJ Rowe, Chief Revenue Officer here at Second Front, and pleasure to be the host today of All Quiet on the Second Front, where boring defense talk comes to die. This is a really exciting conversation and our first ever customer spotlight for a Second Front customer, and no better person to do it with than Arun Nair, CEO and founder at OpsLab, one of the very first customers on the Game Warden platform. Now, 2.5 years ago, we went through this first deployment together, and we went through a lot of firsts together. So, brother, thank you for taking the time, and excited to have you on today.
Thank you so much, TJ. This is a privilege. Thank you for having me here.
Of course. Well, we like to start things off with just tell the audience a little bit about yourself. So what's the Arun story? What's your background? What did you work on? And kind of what brought you down the founder path and then ultimately deploying software to solve critical problems for the Department of Defense?
Yeah. So before starting OpsLab, I spent close to 11 years in FinTech. I was designing trade execution platforms for large sell-side banks. Primarily worked as a C++ programmer, had product ownership responsibilities. The main three asset classes I worked on were fixed income, commodities, and foreign exchange trading. And then 5 years ago, started OpsLab. I had taken a year-long sabbatical, and I was researching what industries are exciting, have opportunities to work on, and primarily decided to focus on air mobility because of my co-founder's expertise in that area. We had actually met in grad school 16 years ago at Texas A&M station. Yeah, he was working on his PhD in industrial engineering, and after his postdoc, he had spent about 8 years working in commercial airlines operations world.
Yep.
Primarily because of it, we decided to focus on air mobility, and that's how we got started.
So as you got into the idea and the inception of OpsLab from out of the gate, how did you kind of go through that effort of market research, pain point identification, prototyping, and was there also a little bit of leverage of you had worked previously in a highly regulated industry? There are some parallels here with defense and national security, or was that kind of totally separate in that calculus?
No, it was extremely relatable. A lot of learnings came from those 11 years working in FinTech, designing large enterprise applications. My process mainly focused on attending a lot of conferences for about a year. I was meeting a lot of industry leaders from commercial airlines world, healthcare sectors, even within the DoD. Learned a lot of challenges within the DoD that could be solved, and there were opportunities in that area. And of course, Austin ecosystem is pretty strong for focusing on DoD, so that helped a lot as well with my research. So yeah, that's how we got started.
So tell us a little bit about OpsLab then. What are you guys working on? What problem are you solving? I think there also tends to be a healthy debate around what is dual use technology and what sort of technologies are solving for similar pain points or problems or workflows between commercial and defense use cases. So yeah, tell us a little bit about what you guys are working on.
Yeah, for the past, I would say 5 years, we've been building this decision support system, focusing on air mobility. So we are optimizing the air mobility. The primary engagement we have is with the US Air Force, where we are looking at how the flying squadrons manage their operations. It's all around flight operations, and we are trying to see how we can improve the throughput of the training programs for these pilots, effectively helping improve the operational readiness, right? So operational readiness, of course, has a lot of areas to focus on. You have to look at the maintenance, whether your planes are ready to deploy, whether your mobility is good to go. And a huge component is your air crew ready to deploy based on whatever mission sets that they are staying ready on. And there is a concern around the throughput of these training programs. And there you have to worry about a lot of these assets like the airplanes, the air range around the Air Force bases. All these are extremely limited assets. And we are seeing how we can improve the throughput of these assets by optimizing their schedules and day-to-day operations.
And on that note, I don't think it's hard to find problems to solve in the Department of Defense. And ideas are cheap, execution is really hard. So how have you guys navigated, the last 3 or 4 years of the real execution of, hey, you have a problem, you have a pain point, we have a product. How do we connect those and get to early adoption that starts to lay the foundation of the house for scale?
Yeah, so first of all, we did get lucky that we were paired with a very motivated customer base. So we started working about 3 years ago with the fighter pilots at Luke Air Force Base, and they were extremely motivated to solve this problem and very driven to solve this problem. So they were extremely generous with their time and attention on helping us understand the problem and coming with an approach to execute the solution, right? Secondly, we did spend a lot of time almost obsessed with the end user's pain points. We spent thousands of hours visiting these Air Force bases, shadowing them on a day-to-day, how they're functioning, what are their pain points. And then we jointly agreed on what would be the definition of min viable product, right? Rather than saying, hey, we're going to solve everything for you from day one, we jointly agreed on what are the biggest pain points, what's the first value that we can deliver, and then we just focus on that. But circling back, I think the focus on the end user's pain point and making sure that their needs were understood, that was the first step for us.
Yeah, and I mean, how unfortunately rare is that the use case, right, where a startup or a founder and entrepreneur jointly agrees on an MVP for an end user in the Department of Defense. So like executing that, I'm sure was no small feat. And there's involvement from, as we talk about growing and scaling businesses in this industry, there's the value of partnerships and the value of the innovation ecosystem. How did you guys leverage that, or how did you approach that from kind of the early days and like just user interviews, getting feedback from customers into MVP, into prototype? How did you guys navigate that?
Yeah, so shout out to AFWorks and Cyber program. So we are AFWorks Cyber success story. We did leverage the whole framework that is put in place. There are a lot of mentors, and the program is well defined. We went through our phase 1 and phase 2 over the past 3-4 years. That resulted in about 8 of these SBIR phase 3 contracts. But phase 2 was extremely critical for us. That's where we understood the importance of what we have this opportunity, right? You have this privilege of working with some highly motivated users within the fighter community, and they were extremely driven to solve this problem. And we had a perfect product market fit because of the expertise that we brought to the table. We have expertise in this field called operations research. That's the technique we use for optimizing the asset allocation. And they understood our expertise really well. And that led to this past 3-4 years of joint development with the end customers.
Yeah, I mean, you guys are like the poster children, right, for success stories through the Cyber program and through AFWorks. As now, more entrants, like more venture capital is pushing into defense and national security. More
Yeah.
startups are entering the space. As you look back on the last 3 or 4 years, what advice would you give, maybe one to yourself 3 or 4 years ago, now that you've gone through this process? And what advice would you give to founders, entrepreneurs that are now entering the space that may or may not be familiar with defense and national security kind of overall as a market?
I think since I've already touched on focusing on the end user, we should utilize phase two very seriously for that purpose to really make sure that the end user's pain points are understood. But besides that, the other thing that really helped us was we invested heavily on prototyping the whole platform, where we gave a pretty well designed clickable prototype to the end user that they could play with. And that kind of showed the 5-year vision, but then that's not something we would deliver in phase two.
Right.
Right. And that was expensive on the onset, but that really proved very valuable for us because that's when the end user were able to really give us the feedback and saying, hey, you're going in the wrong direction. Let's not spend any energy in that versus, hey, this is the area where we should be focusing on. Because as engineers, we sometimes tend to over engineer stuff in areas
Yep.
that don't really add value to the end customer. And we, of course, also had made those mistakes. And because of those prototypes, the end customer could very clearly articulate, hey, that is going in the wrong direction. We don't need more automation, more optimization there. And there are other areas where we should be focusing more on. So that initial investment in prototyping was extremely valuable for us.
Yeah, and I think that's lost on a lot of SBIR phase two projects, right? Where there's so much value that you can get from your mission owner in that phase of providing a prototype. And this could
Yeah,
be, actual mock-ups. It could be just very slick click-throughs
yeah,
to validate, okay, cool. Is this solving the pain point that you're looking for? And is this setting us up for success as a product to ultimately drive value creation for this organization?
exactly. And yeah, besides that, TJ, I do think that there is really good help available out there if you really search for it. I mean,
Yep.
we found you guys in this innovation ecosystem. There are these very critical partnerships that should be established, especially for small businesses. It's very important to find these critical partners who can be very valuable. I mean, in our case, Second Front was a very critical partner, really upfront. Even during phase two itself, we signed up with Second Front, to make that possible for us, and that help is available. I mean, we are in Austin, which is a pretty rich ecosystem in itself, but in general, the ecosystem is pretty helpful and inviting.
Yeah, I mean, it's so strong in Austin with the Capital
Yeah,
Factory and just so many great players there locally for you guys. But broadly, as you look at partner ecosystem and those investments, because they are investments at the end of the day, and we tend to kind of bucket them as like contracting and accreditation as the two very large buckets for software companies. Did you approach it the same way, or did you have kind of a different landscape of here are the types and kind of flavors of partners that we need to have on board to be successful in this phase of execution?
the latter. Ours was pretty much need basis. We
Yep.
realized that for us, having the ATO in place was critical to deploy the solution, so that we could just focus on our core expertise around optimization of asset allocation, right? So, in fact, it was our end customer that made the reference to you guys. So that helped us kind of, understand how we can deploy the solution fast enough. And that was the approach we took. And now, as we are growing and we are thinking more around large scale deployment, we are now being a little bit more thoughtful around what are the long term partnerships we need to establish. But up until now, it's been pretty tactical and nearsighted.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense, and I think that's a perfect segue here to what's next for OpsLab. What projects you guys have underway? What does scale look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to talk about it. So at this point, we are deployed at 56 squadrons across the US Air Force.
Fantastic.
Those are in 30 locations, I would say. Most 90% of them are in North America, but we do have some deployments in other countries. Besides this, we are working with matchcoms for enterprise-wide deployment contracts, because currently the approach we have taken is pretty ground up, where we are contracting with individual Air Force bases on phase 3 contracts. And then we have also deployed the solution on free trial basis for getting the network effect going and getting the feedback loop going with the end users. But the next big milestone is for us to work with Matchcom and see if we can deploy the solution at a wider scale. And besides that, we are also hoping to work with other military branches like Navy and Army, because the good thing is most of these military branches, besides the US Air Force, also operate in very similar fashion. So the
Yep.
solution that we have built can be scaled very easily. There may be some customizations as we handle new aircraft types in MDS, and that is something that we have already done for the US Air Force. And after that, we would also like to focus on the NATO partners and the allied countries for similar efforts. But in the long term horizon, we do want to stay focused on this kind of work, on anything we can do around optimizing the assets to improve the operational readiness in the long run.
Awesome. Well, I believe we're at time here, but Arun, brother, I want to say thank you for not only taking the time today, but for being an early adopter in the game warden journey and going through this process together. There's no way to drive technical solutions for systemic problems in the Department of Defense without great partners and great customers. So I want to thank you for taking the time today and sharing your story and the OpsLab story with the audience.
Thank you, Sergey. Thank you so much.